An empire was quietly taking root in the golden plains of Anatolia. Born from the dreams of horsemen and warriors, this empire grew between two seas, in lands where the waters of the Black Sea seemed to whisper to the Mediterranean. These lands, stretching along the narrow strait, with their rolling hills and fertile valleys where ancient civilizations had risen and fallen for thousands of years, would become the cradle of one of history's most enduring powers. This was the crossroads of three continents. As Europe stretched its fingers toward Asia, Africa looked north across sapphire water, at the meeting point of trade routes and the marching paths of armies since the beginning of time. A small Turkish tribe forged a destiny that would echo for 6 centuries. They stepped onto the stage at a moment when the old order was collapsed. The Byzantine Empire was weakening, the Mongol storm was fading, and the medieval world was reshaping itself. From humble beginnings on the Byzantine frontier, they eventually raised shining domes over conquered Constantinople. They transformed from nomadic horsemen into rulers of a sophisticated state, adopting and absorbing the knowledge of the societies they conquered. Their banners stretched from the rocky shores of the Black Sea to the scorching sands of Arabia, and westward to the very gates of Vienna. Behind them came merchants and scholars, poets and architects, each adding new threads to the rich fabric of the empire. The Ottomans built their power not only through conquest but through blending. They inherited elements of Byzantine administration, Persian court culture, Arab religious tradition, and the tough warrior customs of the Central Asian steppe, shaping them into something unique. They were neither fully Eastern nor fully Western, but a bridge between worlds. Their cities buzzed with a dozen languages. Their markets were filled with goods from Venice to Samarkand. Their palaces were decorated with calligraphy and geometric splendor. Here, sultans ruled both with the sword and with shadow, at a crossroads where East and West met not only on battlefields but in the marketplace of ideas. Under the Ottoman Crescent, different religions lived side by side. Christians, Jews, and Muslims coexisted in an order that was imperfect but remarkable for its time. The arts flourished in grand palaces. Miniature painters worked with single-haired brushes, while poets competed for the Sultan's favor. The whispers of history became etched into ancient stones that still stand today in magnificent mosques, lively bazaars, and marble bathhouses. Their story is one of dramatic military victories and crushing defeats, enlightened rulers and corrupt courtiers, technological innovation and stubborn conservatism. It is the story of an empire that expanded rapidly in its youth, stabilized in its maturity, and slowly declined in old age, following a pattern common to many great powers. From Osman's sword to Ataturk's reform, the Ottoman saga spans centuries and continents. It is the story of an empire that shaped our modern world, its borders, its conflicts, its culture. Long after its flags fell, its legacy lives on in the cuisine of the Balkans, the architecture of Istanbul, the politics of the Middle East, and the map of the world. The story of the Ottoman Empire. The story begins in the late 13th century, when Anatolia, once the heart of Byzantine power, had fragmented into rival principalities. The powerful Anatolian Seljuk Sultanate, which had ruled the region for a long time, was collapsing under internal pressures and the destructive aftermath of Mongol invasions. The Mongol Ilkhanids had established nominal authority over these lands, but their control was fragile at best. In this power vacuum, opportunities were wide open for those bold enough to seize them. On the northwestern frontier of this crumbling Seljuk world, where mountains opened into fertile plains, the borderlands between Muslim and Christian worlds were controlled by Turkish tribal leaders known as beys. These frontier lords commanded mounted warriors called Ghazis, who combined religious zeal with the practical aim of gaining plunder and land. Among these frontier leaders was Ertugrul Bey, head of a small nomadic Turkish tribe. His tribe had migrated westward from Central Asia, fleeing the Mongol invasion. In return for loyal service to the Seljuk Sultan, Ertugrul was granted control over lands around Estin, near the Byzantine frontier. Over time, his people gradually shifted from nomadic herding to settled farming and frontier raiding. After Ertugrul's death, around 1281, leadership of these modest lands passed to his son, Osman Bey. Osman was neither the richest nor the most powerful among the frontier lords, yet he possessed the qualities that would turn his small inheritance into the foundation of an empire. Charismatic and politically shrewd, Osman understood that success required more than military strength. He built alliances through marriage, welcomed skilled refugees from Mongol-controlled areas, and incorporated soldiers who defected from Byzantium into his growing state. Unlike some of his contemporaries who raided indiscriminately, Osman followed a relatively tolerant policy toward Christian peasants who accepted his rule. The early Ottoman state began to take shape through this pragmatic approach. Christians who submitted peacefully were protected and taxed. Those who resisted faced the full force of Osman's increasingly powerful army. Local Greek, Armenian, and Turkish peasants often preferred Ottoman rule to that of Byzantine landowners or rival Turkish beys, finding Osman's tax policies less burdensome. This pattern, combining military expansion with administrative integration of conquered peoples, would become a defining feature of Ottoman statecraft. Ottoman tradition tells of a dream Osman had early in his rise, a dream that became central to the empire's founding narrative. In the dream, a great tree rose from his waist, its branches and leaves covering much of the known world. With mountains beneath its shade, the Caucasus, the Atlas, the Taurus, and the Balkans. From its roots flowed four rivers, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Nile, and the Danube. Ships sailed on these waters. Cities rose along their banks, and above all shone a crescent moon. When Osman told this dream to the respected Sufi sheikh, Sheikh Etabatli, whose daughter he wished to marry, the holy man interpreted it as a sign of a divinely ordained imperial destiny. Whether historical or legendary, the dream served an important purpose. It gave divine legitimacy to Ottoman rule and positioned Osman's descendants as chosen heirs to leadership of the Islamic world. Throughout Ottoman history, the dream was repeatedly invoked to justify the dynasty's claim to lead the Muslim world. Osman's first conquests were modest but strategically important. He took control of Byzantine fortresses and towns around St, expanding his territory and attracting more warriors under his banner. By 1299, Osman had grown strong enough to declare independence from the collapsing Seljuk Sultanate. This date is traditionally considered the birth of the Ottoman state. His followers began calling themselves Ottomans, those who belonged to Osman. The emerging Ottoman state was organized around military needs. Early Ottoman society retained many elements of its nomadic Turkish heritage, while also adopting Byzantine and Seljuk administrative practices. The Ghazi warriors who formed the backbone of Osman's armies were granted land in newly conquered territories, creating a class of cavalry ready for service when called upon in times of war. Markets developed around frontier fortresses, and a rudimentary bureaucracy began to form. Religious institutions played a key role in consolidating Ottoman rule. Osman carefully maintained relationships with Sufi orders, whose mystical understanding of Islam resonated widely among both Turks and new converts. Lodges, established in newly conquered regions, served as centers of both spiritual life and cultural integration, helping incorporate local populations into the Ottoman world. Islamic law provided the framework of governance, though in this early period it was applied with pragmatic flexibility. As Byzantine power continued to decline, Osman's forces advanced deeper into imperial territory. In 1301, his army defeated a Byzantine force at the Battle of Baphius, establishing Ottoman control over much of Bithynia. This victory proved that the Ottomans were no longer mere raiders, but a formidable military force capable of defeating imperial armies in open battle. His son Orhan, who had already proven himself a capable commander, led many of the subsequent campaigns. Father and son gradually captured Byzantine fortresses across northwestern Anatolia, culminating in the long siege of Bursa, a wealthy Byzantine city strategically positioned along key trade routes. Although Osman directed the early phases of the siege, he would not live to see its conclusion. In 1323 or 1324, while the siege of Bursa was still underway, Osman fell ill. Sensing that his end was near, he summoned Orhan and gave his final advice. According to Ottoman sources, he urged his son to rule with justice, to spread the faith with the sword, and to value scholars. Then, with the quiet dignity that had marked his long life, the founder of a great dynasty passed away in his wooden home in St. Orhan completed the conquest of Bursa in 1326 and made it the first capital of the Ottoman state. According to legend, Orhan brought news of the city's fall to his father's tomb. fulfilling Osman's last wish. The modest principality, shaped by Osman's courage, cunning, and charisma, had become a rising power. On the lush hills of Bursa, surrounded by sacred tombs and newly rising mosques, the Ottoman state found its first true home. From Osman's dream-inspired beginnings, his descendants would build a power that would last 6 centuries. The sword of Osman, girded onto each new sultan at the enthronement ceremony, became the symbol of legitimacy passed down through generations of conquerors, builders, poets, and reformers. No one could have foreseen it at the time, but the foundation had been laid for an empire that would span 3 continents and reshape world history. As the Ottoman green banner flew over the minarets of Bursa, the dynasty Osman had founded stood at a turning point. The conquest of this prosperous Byzantine city heralded both an ending and a beginning, the crowning achievement of Osman's vision and the dawn of a new era in Ottoman history. Under the leadership of his son Orhan, the modest frontier principality would transform into a formidable state poised to bridge 2 continents. During Orhan Ghazi's 36-year reign from 1326 to 1362, he inherited not just his father's lands but his legacy, Osman's political shrewdness and talent for establishing his court in Bursa. Orhan set about transforming the Ottoman realm from a loose confederation of Turkish warriors into an organized state. Conquest had brought wealth and prestige, but it had also made governing a substantially non-Turkish and non-Muslim population necessary, a task that demanded far more sophisticated governance than frontier raiding had ever required. Orhan's first innovation was minting the first Ottoman coins, a powerful symbol of sovereign authority. In the newly conquered Bursa, drawing on Byzantine and Iranian administrative practices, he established a rudimentary chancellery. He converted churches into mosques, but also commissioned new religious complexes, including the magnificent Green Mosque that still stands today. These architectural projects announced the arrival of a dynasty with imperial ambitions. The Ottoman military system underwent significant development during this period. While the Ghazi cavalry remained important, Orhan recognized the need for infantry forces capable of conducting sieges and holding territory. Around 1330, he established the Yahya Corps, the first regular Ottoman military unit composed of paid Turkish infantry soldiers. More significantly, he laid the groundwork for the Janissary Corps, an elite force of slave soldiers recruited from the empire's Christian subjects. Later institutionalized as the Devshirme system, this practice involved the periodic collection of Christian boys from rural areas, their conversion to Islam, and their subjection to rigorous training. These young men became the Sultan's personal soldiers, owing their loyalty exclusively to him. Though it may look cruel from a modern perspective, this practice was generally seen as an opportunity in its time. Many families voluntarily handed over their sons to the system, since it opened doors to power and influence that Christian peasants could not attain any other way. The Janissaries would in time become one of the most formidable fighting forces in history and the backbone of Ottoman military power for centuries. While consolidating his territories in Anatolia, Orhan was watching developments across the narrow strait closely. The Byzantine Empire, though weakened, still held Constantinople and its territories in the Balkans. But Byzantine politics had become a snake pit of dynastic rivalries and civil wars. In 1346, an ill-fated decision by Emperor John VI Kantakasinos, who was in conflict with the palace regents, changed the course of history. He called on the Ottomans for military assistance and, in return, gave Orhan his daughter Theodora as a wife. This Byzantine invitation offered the Ottomans the opportunity they had been waiting for. In 1354, an earthquake brought down the walls of various Byzantine fortifications along the Dardanelles. Orhan's son Suleiman Pasha seized the moment, capturing first the castle of Timpan, then the strategically important town of Gallipoli. Ottoman forces established their first permanent foothold in Europe, a bridgehead that would change the course of history by launching the Balkan conquests. Suleiman could not build on this success. He died shortly afterward in a riding accident, but the process he had set in motion was carried forward by his brother Murad, who succeeded Orhan in 1362. During his 27-year reign from 1362 to 1389, Murad transformed the Ottoman state from a regional power into an empire spanning 2 continents. He pursued a strategy of systematic expansion on both the European and Anatolian fronts. In Europe, Ottoman forces continued their steady advance into Thrace, capturing Edirne in 1369. Impressed by the city's strategic position, Murad declared it his new capital, symbolically shifting the Ottoman center of gravity to Europe. From this new base, Ottoman armies pushed into Bulgaria, Serbia, and Macedonia. Ottoman expansion alarmed the Balkan Christian states, who formed a coalition under Serbian Prince Lazar. On June 15, 1389, the 2 armies met at the Battle of Kosovo, one of the historically decisive engagements of the era. The details of the battle have been obscured by centuries of nationalist mythology, but what is known is that both Murad and Lazar lost their lives. Murad was killed by a Serbian nobleman who feigned submission. Lazar was captured and then executed. Costly as it was, Kosovo was an Ottoman victory that broke organized resistance in the Balkans for decades. Murad's son, Bayezid, nicknamed Thunderbolt, had been commanding a wing of the Ottoman army and stepped forward immediately after his father's death, executing his brother to prevent the potential succession struggle and setting a precedent for fratricide as a tool for avoiding civil war. This practice would embed itself in Ottoman tradition. Over 13 turbulent years, from 1389 to 1402, Bayezid dramatically accelerated Ottoman expansion with lightning-fast military strokes. In the Balkans, he reduced Serbia and Bulgaria to vassal states and pushed into Wallachia and Bosnia. When a Crusader army under Hungarian King Sigismund, composed of French and German knights, moved to reclaim the Balkans for Christendom, Bayezid crushed them at the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396. Most of the captured knights were executed, earning Bayezid a fearsome reputation in Western Europe. In Anatolia, Bayezid departed from the cautious approach of his predecessors, who had expanded their territories gradually through alliances and selective campaigns targeting Byzantine territory. Instead, he launched a systematic campaign to absorb the other Turkish principalities, very nearly doubling Ottoman territory in the process. By 1390, the Ottomans had brought much of western and central Anatolia under their control, putting them on a direct collision course with the rising power of Timur in the east. Bayezid's rapid conquests went hand in hand with significant internal developments. He strengthened central authority, curbing the influence of the frontier lords who had operated with relative autonomy. The Ottoman bureaucracy expanded and adopted Persian administrative models. Religious institutions were reinforced with madrasas established in newly conquered territories. Bayezid also began building a naval force, having grasped that control of the seas was essential for an empire with coastlines on multiple fronts. Yet Bayezid's ambitions outran even his considerable military talent. While he was besieging Constantinople, the prize that had eluded his predecessor's word came that the great army of Timur was advancing into Anatolia. This Central Asian conqueror, who claimed descent from Genghis Khan and had built an empire stretching from India to the Mediterranean, had grown increasingly impatient with Bayezid's aggressive treatment of Turkic vassals. On July 20, 1402, the 2 empires clashed outside Ankara. Bayezid commanded a formidable force, but he was outmatched by Timur's numerical and tactical superiority. Turkish units who had defected to Timur's side out of discontent with Ottoman centralizing policies turned the battle into a complete rout. Bayezid himself was captured. By some accounts, he spent his remaining days as a prisoner in Timur's court. The Battle of Ankara came close to destroying the Ottoman state entirely. Timur restored the Turkish principalities that Bayezid had conquered, divided Ottoman Anatolia among Bayezid's sons, and installed his own candidate as ruler in the European territories. After Timur's departure, the Ottoman lands descended into civil war as Bayezid's sons fought each other for supremacy. This period, from 1402 to 1413, is known as the Interregnum, and it threatened a century of Ottoman state building. One of Bayezid's sons, Mehmed I, eventually emerged victorious from this fraternal struggle. Through patience and political skill, He re-established Ottoman control over both the Anatolian and European territories, though he was forced, until his death in 1421, to accept the independence of some principalities and the suzerainty of Timur's successor over certain parts of Anatolia. Mehmed had stabilized the Ottoman state and laid the groundwork for renewed expansion. His son Murad II inherited a recovered but still fragile empire. Over roughly 30 years of rule from 1421 to 1451, Murad worked to secure Ottoman frontiers, re-establish authority over vassal states, and rebuild Ottoman institutions. In Europe, he faced determined resistance from Janos Hunyadi in Hungary and Skanderbeg in Albania, while in Anatolia, he methodically reincorporated the independent principality. Though he never achieved the fame of his predecessors or his successor, Murad's patient policy of consolidation was critical to Ottoman recovery. The Byzantine Empire, in the meantime, had been reduced to little more than Constantinople and its immediate surroundings, managing to keep its capital alive only because the Ottomans were preoccupied with other challenges. In 1444, a Hungarian-led crusade threatened Ottoman control of the Balkans, but Murad crushed these forces decisively at the Battle of Varna, putting an end to European attempts to roll back Ottoman conquests. With Murad's death in 1451, his 19-year-old son Mehmet II came to the throne. The young sultan had already demonstrated both his intelligence and his determination during the two periods when his father had temporarily stepped back from the throne. Once fully in power, Mehmed turned his attention to the target that had eluded his ancestors: Constantinople, what the Turks called the Red Apple, the symbolic heart of Eastern Christendom and the region's most strategically valuable city. What Bayezid had rushed into, Mehmed would accomplish through meticulous preparation. The stage was set for the conquest that would transform the Ottoman state into the Ottoman Empire and change the course of world history. The fall of Constantinople marked the definitive end of the Byzantine Empire and the dawn of a new Ottoman Golden Age. The city had stood as it always had, its massive walls rising defiantly over the waters where Europe and Asia almost touched. Constantinople, ancient Byzantium, had withstood countless sieges throughout history. Founded by Constantine the Great in 330 AD as the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, it had survived even when Rome itself fell. Against wars, plagues, crusades, and internal conflicts, the Queen of Cities had stood firm, preserving within its boundaries the treasures of classical civilization in its libraries and churches. But now, in the spring of 1453, Constantinople faced its greatest test. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine Onsa Palaiologos, commanded a defensive force of barely 7,000 men to hold walls that stretched 4 miles. His empire, which had once extended across 3 continents, had shrunk to the city itself and a handful of scattered coastal outposts outside the walls. And beyond those walls waited an army more numerous, more determined, and better equipped than any that had come before. In 1451, following the death of his father Murad II, Mehmed II ascended the Ottoman throne for the second time. The young sultan was only 19, but those around him who mistook his youth for weakness quickly found out how wrong they were. Mehmed possessed a sharp intellect, an iron will, and ambitions that would far outstrip the conquests of his ancestors. He made his intentions plain from the moment he took the throne. "What my fathers tried to achieve through many campaigns," he said, "I will accomplish in a single stroke." Constantinople was his obsession, the prize that would transform the Ottoman state into a true empire. He studied the city's defenses, read accounts of previous failed sieges over and over again, and set about making meticulous preparations for the conquest. In 1452, Mehmed ordered the construction of a powerful fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus, directly opposite the older Anatolia Hisarlik on the Asian side. Named Rumeli Hisari, the 2 castles together formed a barrier that cut the throat of the strait, allowing complete control over all sea traffic passing through. When a Venetian ship attempted to break the blockade, the crew was executed and the captain impaled a message that left no room for misinterpretation for anyone else considering the same. Inside Constantinople, Emperor Constantine watched these developments with mounting alarm. He sent desperate appeals to Western Europe for help and agreed to the union of the Orthodox and Catholic churches, a move that would provoke deep resentment among his own people, who still remembered vividly the Crusader sack of their city in 1204. The response, however, was thin. Petty rivalries, religious differences, and the growing scale of Ottoman power all discouraged intervention. In the end, only a few hundred professional soldiers arrived from Genoa. In Venice, along with a capable Genoese engineer named Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, who took charge of strengthening the city's defenses. The Ottoman preparations were breathtaking in their scale and ingenuity. Mehmed assembled an army of roughly 80,000 men, elite Janissary infantry, Anatolian Turkish cavalry, and auxiliary forces from vassal states in Europe, to bring down Constantinople's legendary walls. He commissioned a Hungarian-born cannon founder named Urban to build siege artillery of unprecedented power. The Byzantines had been unable to meet Urban's salary demands, so the engineer had offered his services to Mehmed instead, an unfortunate decision that would alter the course of history. The result was an enormous cannon capable of hurling stone balls weighing up to 1,500 pounds, requiring 60 oxen to move, and audible miles away when it fired. This basilica cannon was accompanied by dozens of smaller but still formidable pieces capable of reducing the medieval walls, built in an earlier century, to rubble. The Ottoman fleet tightened the blockade from the sea. The Byzantines had stretched a massive chain across the Golden Horn to protect this natural harbor from enemy ships. Mehmed's fleet of more than 120 vessels cut off any reinforcement reaching the city by sea. On April 6, 1453, the Ottoman army took up positions before the walls of Constantinople, and Mehmed sent Constantine his first and only offer of surrender, the emperor's life and the safety of his people in exchange for the city. Constantine's reply was dignified but firm. He would not hand over the city. The siege began the following day. For weeks, Ottoman artillery hammered the land walls relentlessly, particularly the more vulnerable sections of the Theodosian Wall. Byzantine engineers worked through every night to repair the damage, filling breaches with a mixture of stone, timber, barrels, and earth-packed cloth. Ottoman assault attempts on these weakened sections were repeatedly driven back at heavy cost, thanks to the courage that desperation had given the defenders. Faced with unexpectedly stubborn resistance, Mehmed knew that breaking the Golden Horn chain was essential to completing the encirclement of the city. In one of the boldest military maneuvers in history, he had his engineers construct a wooden slipway greased with animal fat. In a single night, dozens of Ottoman ships were hauled overland from the Bosphorus across the Galata Peninsula and lowered into the Golden Horn behind the protective chain. At dawn on April 22, Byzantine defenders looked out in horror to find Ottoman ships in waters they had thought were safe. Even this heavy blow did not break the resistance. A Byzantine night raid aimed at burning the Ottoman ships in the Golden Horn failed. The brave sailors who had taken that risk were captured and executed. Ottoman assaults on the walls were repeatedly repulsed, but each success cost the defenders irreplaceable lives. Both sides could see that time was working in favor of the attackers. The Byzantines were running out of men, food, and hope. By late May, the walls bore the unmistakable scars of weeks of continuous bombardment. Mehmed convened a war council and announced his decision to launch the final general assault. Before the attack, he addressed his troops, promising them the traditional 3 days of free plunder that Islamic laws of war granted after a successful conquest. To drive them further, he positioned his forces in a way designed to stoke competition between units and offered special rewards to whoever entered the city first. Inside Constantinople, Constantine XI gathered his commanders for a final council. The last emperor of Byzantium, knowing what the next day would bring, spoke movingly of the city's legacy and the debt of defense they all shared. He then walked the walls to encourage his exhausted soldiers, and finally made his way to Hagia Sophia for what would be the last religious service of the Imperial era. In that desperate hour, Orthodox and Catholic clergy set aside their divisions and prayed together for salvation. The final assault began in the early hours of May 29, 1453. Wave after wave of Ottoman soldiers surged forward trying to breach the walls. The first attack by volunteer forces was repulsed. The second wave of Anatolian troops met the same fate. Then the Janissaries came, disciplined, ferocious, and utterly determined. They concentrated their assault near the gate of St. Romanus, where the walls had suffered the heaviest damage. At this critical moment, the Genoese commander Giustiniani was seriously wounded. As he was carried off the walls, panic spread through the defenders. A small gate left open for evacuation was left unguarded, and some Ottoman soldiers found this unprotected entrance. At the same moment, a group of Janissaries managed to scale the walls near the Blautrani Palace, and Ottoman banners began appearing on the battlements. In many sections, resistance collapsed. When Constantine XI saw that the city was lost, he tore off his imperial insignia and personally led one last charge against the invaders, choosing to die fighting as a soldier rather than be taken prisoner. His body was never officially identified, though Mehmed later arranged a respectful burial for a body believed to be Constantine's. By midday, the Ottoman conquest was complete. Mehmed rode into the fallen city and went straight to Hagia Sophia. Stopping a soldier who had begun breaking up the marble floor, he said, "Be content with plunder and prisoners. The buildings of the city are mine." The Sultan had the great church converted into a mosque, ensuring that this transformation would stand as a symbol of Ottoman victory over Eastern Christendom. The three-day sack began, as the laws of war prescribed. Priceless treasures were destroyed or carried off. Thousands of citizens were condemned to slavery, and buildings were damaged. Yet Mehmed's true vision was not destruction but transformation. Once the permitted period of plunder had ended, he set about rebuilding Constantinople as the new Ottoman capital. The Sultan worked to repopulate the city by inviting former residents to return and bringing Muslims, Christians, and Jews from across the empire to settle there. He secured the continued existence of the church under Ottoman rule by appointing a new Orthodox patriarch. Gennadios, tax incentives, revived trade, and major construction projects began transforming the city's skyline with Ottoman architectural elements. Over time, the city came to be known by its Turkish name, Istanbul, though both names continued to be used for centuries. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves across Europe. Pope Nicholas V called for a crusade, but the response was largely muted. Western powers were increasingly absorbed in their own internal rivalries, and the opportunities opening up through Atlantic exploration. In the Islamic world, Mehmed's victory was a cause for celebration. The fulfillment of a hadith attributed to the Prophet Muhammad foretelling that Muslims would one day conquer Constantinople. For the Ottomans, the fall of Constantinople was a turning point. No longer a frontier principality or a regional power, the Ottoman state had become an empire with a cosmopolitan capital spanning Europe and Asia. The young sultan, who had taken on all the risks of the conquest and been rewarded with victory, adopted several titles, among them Caesar, positioning himself as the legitimate heir to the Roman emperors. The process that began with Constantinople would continue in Foti's subsequent campaigns into the Balkans, Anatolia, and the Black Sea region. But history would remember him, above all, for Constantinople, as the Sultan who ended the 1,000-year Byzantine Empire and opened a new chapter in the region's history. As the call to prayer rang out for the first time from the minarets of Hagia Sophia, the medieval world gave way to a new order. The Eastern Roman Empire was now history. In its place, the Ottoman Empire was rising, ready for its golden age, destined to shape the fate of 3 continents for centuries to come. In the decades following the conquest of Constantinople, the Ottoman Empire entered what historians would later call its golden age. From the mid-15th century through the 16th, a succession of extraordinary sultans expanded Ottoman territory, developed sophisticated governing institutions, and created the conditions for culture and the arts to flourish. During this remarkable period, the empire reached the height of its power and prosperity, rising to become one of the most formidable states in the world. Buoyed by his triumph at Constantinople, Mehmet the Conqueror continued his campaigns of expansion until his death in 1481. He eliminated the remaining Byzantine remnants in the Black Sea region, conquered Serbia, and pushed deep into Greece and Albania. When the Venetians challenged Ottoman sea power, he built a navy capable of wresting much of the Aegean from their grip. In Anatolia, he finally absorbed the independent Turkish principalities, creating a unified Turkish state for the first time since the Seljuk era. By the time of his death, Fatih had more than doubled Ottoman territory. Fatih's contributions went far beyond military expansion. He gave the Ottoman state a more centralized structure, curtailing the influence of the frontier lords and the old Turkish families. He built a sophisticated administrative system drawing on Byzantine, Islamic, and Turkish traditions. He drew up law codes that regulated Ottoman governance, established clear hierarchies and rules, and would serve as a guide for generations. Mehdi was also a patron of the arts and learning. He rebuilt Constantinople as a magnificent capital, commissioning the vast Topkapi Palace complex as the center of the new Ottoman power. He established libraries, madrasas, hospitals, and various public institutions. The Sultan was himself a poet and spoke several languages. He invited Italian artists to his court, including Gentile Bellini, and patronized Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars equally. After Fatih's death and a brief succession struggle that left his son Sen Sultan behind, Bayezid II came to the throne. Where his father had been a warrior sultan constantly on campaign, Bayezid was a more contemplative character who prioritized consolidation over expansion. His reign from 1481 to 1512 was a period of relative peace and internal development. Bayezid strengthened Ottoman naval power, building a fleet capable of competing with the European maritime states in the Mediterranean. In 1492, he opened his doors to the thousands of Jews expelled from Spain, who enriched Ottoman society with their knowledge in medicine, trade, and craftsmanship. The Sultan himself was a mystic with Sufi leanings, and he supported religious endowments and scholarly work. As Bayezid aged, his sons entered into a race for the throne. His energetic son Selim, who was serving as governor of Trabzon, grew increasingly impatient with his father's cautious policies, particularly regarding the Safavid threat in the east. In 1512, backed by the Janissaries, Selim forced his father to abdicate and, once on the throne, swiftly moved to eliminate his brothers and nephews. During his short but consequential 8-year reign from 1512 to 1520, Selim the Grim put the empire through a profound transformation. His first target was Shah Ismail of Iran, founder of the Safavid dynasty. The Safavids had embraced Shia Islam and gained powerful influence among the Turkish tribes of eastern Anatolia, posing a serious threat to Ottoman authority. At the Battle of Chaldron in 1514, Selim's artillery and the Janissaries' firearms proved decisive against Safavid cavalry. The victory brought eastern Anatolia under Ottoman control and established a military frontier that would roughly sketch out the border between modern Turkey and Iran. Selim then turned south and brought down the Mamluk Sultanate, which had ruled over Egypt, Syria, and the Hejaz for centuries. In 2 campaigns carried out with breathtaking speed, Ottoman forces conquered Syria in 1516 and Egypt in 1517. With these victories, the holiest cities of Islam, Mecca and Medina, also came under Ottoman control. The last Abbasid caliph, who had essentially been kept as a puppet by the Mamluks, handed over the symbols of the caliphate to Selim, adding religious authority on top of Ottoman military power. While the legitimacy of this transfer was disputed in Islamic law, it became a key element in the Ottoman claim to leadership over the Sunni Muslim world. These conquests dramatically expanded the empire's resources and strategic position. Egypt's agricultural wealth generated enormous tax revenues. Control of the Red Sea opened up trade routes leading to the Indian Ocean. The empire now covered much of the Islamic world, incorporating not just its Turkish and Balkan subjects but also a vastly enlarged Arab population. When Selim died suddenly in 1520, he left his son Suleiman a greatly expanded empire with secure borders and plenty of resources. Suleiman made excellent use of this inheritance during his remarkably long reign, which stretched across nearly half a century. From 1520 to 1566, the Ottoman Empire reached its height in terms of power, territory, and cultural achievement. The new sultan was 25 years old, educated in the palace school, and already seasoned with administrative experience from serving as a provincial governor. He proved his military abilities quickly, taking Belgrade in 1521, a fortress that had held out against Ottoman assaults for generations. The following year, his forces expelled the Knights Hospitaller from the island of Rhodes after a grueling 6-month siege, wiping out yet another deeply rooted Christian stronghold in Ottoman waters. Suleiman then set his sights on Hungary, the dominant Christian power in southeastern Europe. At the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, the Ottoman army crushed the Hungarian forces. King Louis II and the bulk of Hungary's nobility lost their lives. This devastating defeat split Hungary 3 ways: direct Ottoman rule in the central regions, Habsburg claims in the west, and a semi-independent Transylvania in the east. The Ottoman Empire now reached deep into the heart of Central Europe. In 1529, Suleiman launched a major campaign against Vienna, the Habsburg capital. The siege came to nothing. Early winter conditions and overextended supply lines saw to that, but it marked the furthest point Ottoman forces would ever push into Europe. For the next century and a half, the Ottomans and the Habsburgs kept fighting over southeastern Europe without either side ever managing to gain the upper hand decisively. Although the European front tends to get more attention in the history books, Suleiman also ran extensive campaigns in the east. He launched 3 major expeditions against Safavid Persia, captured Baghdad, and tightened Ottoman control over Mesopotamia. Naval operations in the Indian Ocean put Portuguese dominance under serious pressure. In the Mediterranean, the Ottoman fleet under Hayreddin Barbarossa, known to Europeans as Barbarossa, or Redbeard, seized control of the seas. Barbarossa's career is really the symbol of Ottoman naval ascendancy during this period. Starting from modest origins as a corsair, he rose all the way to Grand Admiral of the Ottoman Navy, routing Christian fleets and bringing North African territories under Ottoman rule. Operating from bases in Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, Ottoman naval forces dominated the central and eastern Mediterranean, threatening trade routes and raiding coastal settlements. Ottoman diplomacy also took on new dimensions during Suleiman's reign. Breaking with the Islamic tradition that largely regarded Christian powers as enemies, the Sultan forged a strategic alliance with France against their shared Habsburg rival. The Ottoman fleet wintered in French ports, and the 2 powers coordinated their military operations. Trade agreements, known as the capitulations, gave French merchants privileged status in Ottoman ports. Similar arrangements were later extended to other European powers. Originally symbols of Ottoman strength and generosity, these agreements gradually turned into tools of European economic leverage. The Sultan's military successes earned him the title lawgiver among his Turkish subjects, and magnificent in European chronicles. But his reign mattered just as much for what happened at home. Suleiman tasked the chief military judge with codifying and reforming Ottoman law in a way that balanced Islamic Sharia with secular regulations. This comprehensive legal system provided a framework for governing the empire's diverse populations, and with various modifications stayed in force until the 19th century. The Ottoman administrative system reached its mature form during Suleiman's reign. At its center was the palace complex, where the Sultan governed with the help of the Imperial Council, known as the Divan-i-Humayun. This governing body included the Grand Vizier, who effectively acted as prime minister, other viziers handling different areas of administration, military commanders, and the chief financial and judicial officials. A sophisticated bureaucracy, trained in the palace schools, put policy into practice across the empire. The whole system rested on carefully maintained balances of power. Most senior officials had come up through the Devshirme system. They owed their positions not to noble birth, but to direct loyalty to the Sultan. This slave elite arrangement prevented the growth of a hereditary aristocracy that could have threatened imperial authority. On the other side, the ulama Islamic scholars, led by the Ahl Islam, maintained meaningful autonomy in religion, education, and justice, acting as a counterweight to executive power. Provincial administration was organized along similar lines. Governors appointed from the center ran the major provinces, while locally appointed judges and military commanders who answered directly to Istanbul kept those governors in check. The Timur system, which granted land rights to cavalry soldiers in return for military service, extended imperial authority into the countryside while maintaining a separate military force independent of the Janissary. Economically, the empire thrived on its control of the major trade routes connecting Europe, Asia, and Africa. Ottoman territories included long-established craft centers producing textiles, ceramics, metalwork, and luxury goods. The imperial workshops in Istanbul turned out items of exceptional quality for the palace. Guild organizations regulated urban production, upheld standards, and kept competition under control. State-imposed price controls were meant to ensure that city populations could get hold of basic goods and to prevent unrest in strategically important cities. Agriculture formed the backbone of the economy, generating tax revenue and feeding a growing urban population. Most farmers were free peasants rather than serfs, though they were tied to their land for tax purposes. The empire kept grain stockpiles to guard against famine and stabilize prices. Long-distance trade was also flourishing, with merchants from Turkish, Arab, Greek, Armenian, and Jewish communities building commercial networks both inside the empire and beyond its borders. This economic prosperity fed remarkable cultural and architectural achievements. Suleiman's chief architect, Mimar Sinan, best represents the Ottoman artistic peak. Born into a Christian family in Anatolia and brought into the system through the Dev, Sinan converted to Islam and worked his way up through military engineering before channeling his talent into architecture. Over a career spanning 50 years, he designed hundreds of structures across the empire: mosques, bridges, palaces, bathhouses, and caravanserais. His greatest works include the Kezid Mosque, dedicated to Suleiman's beloved son, the Suleimani, the Sultan's own complex in Istanbul, and the Selimi Mosque in Edirne, which he completed in his 80s. These buildings blended the Byzantine sense of space, especially the broad central dome, with Islamic architectural traditions and Ottoman innovations. The style that emerged carried a genuinely Ottoman identity while earning universal admiration for its engineering brilliance and aesthetic balance. Literature flourished equally under imperial patronage. Ottoman Turkish poetry, though deeply shaped by Persian models, developed its own distinctive voice and reached its classical form during this period. The court supported historians who documented the empire's achievements, scientists who pushed forward knowledge in astronomy and mathematics, and religious scholars who produced original works in theology and law. Into this world of power and splendor stepped a figure who would deeply shape the second half of Suleiman's reign, Hurrem Sultan. This remarkable woman, captured in what is now Ukraine and enslaved in the imperial harem, won the Sultan's heart, became his legal wife, and gained extraordinary influence. Breaking with tradition, Suleiman moved her into the main sections of the palace, rather than keeping her in the separate harem quarters. She bore him several children and remained his closest confidant until her death in 1558. Hurrem Sultan's rise transformed harem politics. Previously, sultans had kept their distance from concubines once sons were born, in order to limit any one mother's influence over rival princes. Hurrem changed that dynamic entirely, managing to stay close to both Suleiman and her sons. She built charitable institutions, corresponded with foreign rulers, and influenced appointments and policy decisions. Some historians have painted her as scheming and manipulative, but the evidence suggests she formed a genuine partnership with Suleiman and shared his concerns about imperial stability. The final decade of Suleiman's reign was overshadowed by succession struggles among his sons. His eldest son and most promising heir, Mustafa, fell victim to court intrigues that almost certainly involved Hurrem's desire to advance her own sons. The Sultan had Mustafa executed in 1553, while the army was on campaign in Persia. The decision shocked his contemporaries, and some historians see it as the beginning of the empire's long decline. After Harim's death in 1558, Suleiman fell into deep grief. His remaining sons, Selim and Bayezid, soon came to open conflict. Following Bayezid's defeat and execution, the less capable Selim remained as the sole heir. By 1566, Suleiman was in his 70s, yet he still took the field at the head of his army, this time in Hungary, against Habsburg forces. While the siege of Szegeffer was proceeding successfully, the old sultan died in his tent. Grand Vizier Sakala Mehmed Pasha kept the death secret until Selim could take the throne, continuing the campaign as though the sultan were still alive, while ensuring a smooth transfer of power. As Suleiman's body was being brought back to Istanbul for burial, the Ottoman Empire stood at its peak. Its territories stretched from Algeria to the Persian Gulf, from Crimea to Yemen. Its armies were the most powerful in the Mediterranean world. Its bureaucracy, the most sophisticated. Its cities, the most magnificent. The system Suleiman had perfected seemed built to last. Yet, hidden within this golden age were the seeds of future difficulties. The practice of executing princes, taken to a new level with Mustafa's death, would eventually give way to confining them in the palace, which meant inexperienced rulers ascending the throne. The Timur cavalry system was already losing its military relevance compared to Janissary infantry. The pace of Ottoman technological innovation was falling behind developments in Europe, and the enormous wealth flowing into the empire was laying the groundwork for inflation and economic disruption that would strain the administrative system in the years ahead. None of these problems were visible when Selim II succeeded his father. The Ottoman Empire had reached heights that few political entities in history had ever achieved, bringing together diverse peoples and regions in a functioning imperial system that offered security, prosperity, and cultural achievement to millions. The legacy of this golden age in architecture, art, literature, law, and governance lasted long after Ottoman power faded, continuing to shape the modern Middle East, North Africa, and the Balkans in ways that are still visible today. At its height, the Ottoman Empire governed an enormous territory spanning dozens of ethnic communities, religious groups, and distinct cultural traditions. From the deserts of North Africa to the steppes of Crimea, from the mountains of the Balkans to the river valleys of Mesopotamia, Ottoman rule held together lands with profoundly different histories and populations. How did a single imperial system manage this diversity so successfully for so long? The answer lies in the distinctive governing structures, social arrangements, and cultural patterns that defined Ottoman civilization. At the heart of Ottoman governance was a principle of pragmatic flexibility. Rather than imposing uniform administration across all their territories, the Ottomans adapted to local conditions while maintaining core imperial institutions. This approach allowed them to absorb new territories with minimal disruption while gradually extending central authority into the provinces. At the top of the system sat the Sultan, the person who embodied the state and held what was theoretically absolute power. Legitimacy came from multiple sources. The Sultan was the guardian of Islam's holy sites, the heir to Byzantine emperors, the protector of trade routes, and the continuator of an unbroken male lineage going back to Osman. In practice, though, the Sultan's authority was constrained by Islamic law, established custom, and the practical limits of pre-modern communication and transportation. Below the Sultan, the imperial government operated through specialized departments overseen by the Divan-i-Hukam. The Grand Vizier, as chief minister, coordinated the administration and could represent the Sultan in most matters. Other viziers, treasury officials, chancellors, and military commanders made up the upper levels of government. These officials met regularly to discuss affairs of state, while the Sultan sometimes observed their sessions from behind a screened window. Most senior officials had been trained through the Devshirme system, the periodic recruitment of boys of Christian origin from rural areas of the Balkans and Anatolia, converted to Islam and educated in the palace schools. These individuals formed an elite who owed their positions not to noble birth or tribal connections, but directly to their loyalty to the Sultan. His slave elite system prevented the emergence of a hereditary aristocracy, which had caused serious problems in many other Islamic states. The military was also organized to distribute power in a balanced way. The Janissary Corps, elite infantry recruited through the Devshirme system, formed the empire's professional army at its core. Their skill with firearms made them formidable on the battlefield, and their presence in major cities secured imperial interests. Provincial cavalry forces, allocated land under the Timur system, balanced Janissary influence, and extended imperial authority into the countryside. Artillery units, naval forces, and auxiliary troops rounded out a military machine that was at its peak, the most effective fighting force in the Mediterranean world. Religious institutions formed another pillar of imperial governance. The ulama scholars trained in Islamic law and theology formed a separate hierarchy under the ahalasam, who could issue rulings binding even on the sultan. Religious endowments known as vakifs operated mosques, madrasas, hospitals, soup kitchens, and various public service facilities, enjoying considerable autonomy. These institutions both delivered vital social services and connected various regions to the imperial center through networks of religious learning and charity. Perhaps the most distinctive feature was the way the empire managed religious diversity through the millet system. Rather than imposing uniformity, the Ottomans recognized the major religious communities as institutions with the right to self-govern in many areas. Each millet organized itself under its own religious leadership, handling personal status matters, marriage, divorce, inheritance, according to its own religious law. The Greek Orthodox millet, headed by the Patriarch of Constantinople, was the largest non-Muslim community. Armenian Christians, various Eastern Christian denominations, and Jews all established their own millets with similar degrees of autonomy. This arrangement reflected Islamic jurisprudence on the people of the book, but the Ottomans turned it into a sophisticated administrative system. Non-Muslims paid a special tax called the jizya in exchange for protection and exemption from military service. While the supremacy of Islam was clearly established, the millet system offered a significant degree of religious freedom at a time when Europe was being torn apart by sectarian conflict. When Spain expelled its Jewish population in 1492, thousands found refuge in Ottoman territory. The words attributed to Sultan Bayezid to about the Spanish monarchs sum up the attitude well. By sending him their skilled Jewish refugees, they were impoverishing their own country while enriching his. The millet system reflected a broader Ottoman approach to difference. Clear hierarchies were maintained: Muslims over non-Muslims, Turks over non-Turks, men over women, yet the empire created spaces where diversity could take root. Ottoman elites took pride in managing a complex, multicultural world more effectively than their European rivals. An Ottoman administrator from the 16th century is said to have described the empire as a garden where every flower contributes to the whole while keeping its own unique beauty. Economically, the Ottoman Empire also integrated into global trade networks, connecting diverse production regions within a single imperial market. The empire controlled the major commercial routes between Europe and Asia, especially after the conquest of Egypt and Syria secured the eastern Mediterranean and Red Sea corridor. Ottoman territories included significant production centers for textiles, ceramics, metalwork, and agricultural goods. State intervention in the economy focused mainly on securing urban food supplies, maintaining quality standards for exports, and preventing any single group from monopolizing essential trades. Guild organizations regulated urban production across the empire. Through these professional associations, standards were set, access to trades was controlled, social services were provided to members, and a link was maintained between craftsmen and the state. Guild membership cut across religious lines. Muslims, Christians, and Jews worked side by side in many trades. The guild system allowed for significant autonomy while also making urban economies easier to oversee and tax. Agriculture was the foundation of imperial prosperity, with the vast majority of the population making their living by farming. Peasant producers benefited from legal and customary protections, and their tax obligations were generally predictable. State policy limiting large landholdings reflected a preference for small farms, both for tax efficiency and for maintaining the supply of soldiers. State grain warehouses helped soften the worst effects of periodic famines and kept urban unrest in check. Trade networks spread across the empire, with merchants from various backgrounds building commercial relationships that crossed regional and religious lines. Greeks and Armenians handled much of the internal trade, while Turkish, Arab, and Persian merchants maintained ties with more distant Muslim lands. Jewish communities specialized in international trade, building connections with coreligionists in Europe and across the Mediterranean. By the 16th century, Ottoman cities had become major consumption centers for luxury goods from all over the world. This economic integration nourished a distinctive urban culture. Ottoman cities were organized around central complexes that brought together mosques, markets, bathhouses, and educational institutions. Neighborhoods generally took shape along religious lines, with each community clustering around its own places of worship, while commercial districts brought different communities together in a shared space. Markets specialized by product, spices, textiles, metalwork, creating efficient commercial ecosystems. The Ottoman capital displayed this urban culture at its most developed. After the conquest of Constantinople, Mehmed II had rebuilt the sparsely populated Byzantine city as a magnificent Islamic capital, while preserving its Christian heritage. Known as Istanbul, though both names stayed in use for centuries, the city was built around the great mosque complexes constructed by successive sultans. A skyline of domes and minarets stood in visual balance with the ancient churches that still served the Christian population. Topkapi Palace, perched on the old Acropolis at the junction of the Bosphorus, the Golden Horn, and the Sea of Marmara served as both the Sultan's residence and the empire's administrative center. By the late 16th century, Istanbul had become one of the largest cities in the world, with a population exceeding 500,000. This cosmopolitan metropolis drew people from every corner of the empire and beyond. In its markets, you could hear dozens of languages: Italian, Persian, Greek, Arabic, Slavic dialects, Armenian. Each community maintained its own cultural identity while adapting to the Ottoman context and contributing to the city's cultural life. In the process, a distinctive urban identity emerged that transcended individual ethnic origins. The material culture of Ottoman cities reflected this cosmopolitan sensibility. Architecture blended the Byzantine sense of space with Islamic decorative traditions and Ottoman structural innovations. Textiles combined motifs from Persian, Chinese, Italian, and local traditions. Iznik ceramics were produced using techniques developed from European porcelain making while displaying patterns with Chinese influence. Ottoman cuisine blended cooking traditions from Central Asia, Persia, the Arab world, and the Balkans into a distinctly Ottoman food culture unified but internally varied. This cultural synthesis extended into intellectual life. The Ottoman court patronized scholars, poets, historians, and scientists from all sorts of backgrounds. A literary culture emerged in which educated Ottomans moved comfortably between Turkish, Arabic, and Persian. Turkish served as the administrative language, while Arabic remained the language of religion and law, and Persian held its place as the language of high culture and poetry. Ottoman Turkish poetry reached a particularly high level of refinement during the empire's golden age. Following Persian models but developing its own forms and sensibilities, Ottoman poets produced works of extraordinary elegance, sustained by a constant play of double meanings and allusions. Poets like Baki and Fuzuli explored love, power, beauty, and impermanence both in human and divine terms. Sultan Suleiman himself was a noteworthy poet, writing under the pen name Muhibi. Historical writing flourished under imperial patronage, with court historians composing works aimed at passing on the empire's achievements to future generations. These works blended factual narrative with literary craftsmanship and moral lessons, presenting Ottoman victories as evidence of divine favor while trying to draw instructive lessons from setbacks. Scholars produced encyclopedic works that combine knowledge gathered from European sources with the Islamic scholarly tradition, covering everything from geography to botany. Religious scholarship stayed vibrant throughout this period. The Mevli order, known in the West as the Whirling Dervishes, and the Bektashi order added distinctive practices and interpretations to Islamic spirituality. Sunni Orthodox scholars produced original legal opinions addressing new situations the empire faced. The interaction between the mystical approach of Sufism and the legal framework of Sharia created a dynamic religious ecosystem that had room for popular piety and intellectual rigor alike. Science and medicine built on the achievements of the earlier Islamic Golden Age. Ottoman observatories made significant contributions, producing accurate star catalogs and planetary tables. Medical knowledge combined the Greek-rooted tradition of classical Islamic medicine with empirical observations and techniques drawn from various traditions. Ottoman surgeons developed specialized methods for eye operations, fracture treatment, and other conditions, leaving illustrated medical texts that documented their anatomical understanding. The visual arts developed along a distinctive path shaped by Islamic reservations about figurative representation in religious contexts. Calligraphy emerged as the preeminent art form. Masters developed styles of extraordinary elegance and complexity for rendering Quranic verses and poetic works. Geometric and floral patterns in architectural decoration reached remarkable levels of refinement, while figurative representation was avoided in religious settings. Ottoman miniature painting flourished for historical manuscripts, scientific works, and literary texts, depicting court ceremonies, military campaigns, city views, and natural phenomena in meticulous detail. Music held a central place in Ottoman cultural life. A sophisticated system of musical modes known as makam developed across contexts ranging from military bands to Sufi ceremonies, from court entertainments to popular festivals. Capable of expressing subtle emotional states, it drew on Arab, Persian, Byzantine, and Turkish traditions. Distinctive instruments like the ney, tambour, and kudum, passed down from master to student through oral tradition, produced the characteristic sound of Ottoman classical music. Daily life for ordinary Ottomans varied enormously depending on location, religion, occupation, and social status. For the majority, the rhythm of life was shaped by the agricultural seasons and religious calendars. Muslim, Christian, and Jewish communities each celebrated their own religious holidays and life cycle rituals. Public spaces that brought different communities together always existed. The bathhouse functioned as a place for socializing, and markets, coffeehouses, and gardens enriched that social landscape. Coffee culture took root in the 16th century as a distinctly Ottoman social institution. Coffee, arriving from Yemen, quickly became the empire's favorite drink, and specialized coffeehouses opened in the major cities. These establishments served as hubs for the exchange of news, literary conversation, political debate, and entertainment. Because of the central role coffee houses played in social life, they were sometimes shut down during periods of unrest, on the grounds that they served as centers of opposition. Family life was built around the household, which typically included extended family members and, in wealthier homes, servants or enslaved people. Marriage practices varied by religion and region, but most households were organized under patriarchal authority. Women's experiences differed greatly depending on class and position. Elite women gained real influence through family connections and economic activity, while peasant women worked alongside men in agricultural production. Although gender separation was the norm in public life, women maintained lively social networks in contexts that were considered gender appropriate. Popular entertainment included shadow puppet theater, like Karogs, which told satirical stories, metas who performed epic narratives, and sporting events like oil, wrestling, and archery. Religious festivals brought communities together for processions, feasts, and celebrations. Sultans organized grand public festivities for circumcisions, weddings, and military victories, distributing food and gifts to reinforce people's loyalty. Education followed different paths for different social groups. The majority of children attended neighborhood schools attached to mosques, churches, or synagogues. Advanced education for Muslims centered on madrasas, which taught Islamic law, theology, logic, and literature. The palace school provided specialist training for future administrators and military leaders. While formal education was largely restricted to men, the informal transmission of knowledge within the household allowed women to acquire the practical skills, cultural knowledge, and religious understanding appropriate to their expected roles. The Ottoman legal system balanced religious law with imperial legislation. Sharia courts presided over by qadis handled most legal and criminal matters for Muslims, while non-Muslims could turn to their own religious courts or to Ottoman courts. The Sultan's authority to issue secular decrees on public administration allowed the empire to deal with situations that religious jurisprudence didn't cover. This dual system, religious and secular, offered both flexibility and legitimacy. By the mid-16th century, this complex social, political, and cultural system had reached its mature form. The Ottoman Empire developed governing structures capable of managing extraordinary diversity while maintaining imperial cohesion. Its cultural achievements reflected both the synthesis of many traditions and original contributions across numerous fields. Though various challenges would arise in the centuries ahead, the foundations laid by Ottoman civilization in this period showed remarkable staying power, shaping life across the Eastern Mediterranean world for generations. This system had many strengths: its flexibility in absorbing diverse peoples, its ability to balance central authority with local autonomy, its blending of religious legitimacy with practical governance, and its openness to cultural exchange and innovation within established frameworks. But these same strengths also contained potential weaknesses. The delicate balances between rival centers of power could break down under weak leadership. The tension between religious ideals and pragmatic compromise was open to exploitation by religious conservatives, and the sheer scale of the empire made it inherently difficult to maintain consistent control as technologies and economic patterns evolved. As the 16th century drew to a close, the Ottoman Empire stood at its peak, a sophisticated, cosmopolitan civilization spread across 3 continents. Its cultural and institutional achievements would leave lasting marks on lands stretching from the Balkans to Arabia, from North Africa to the Caucasus. Even as difficulties emerged in the centuries that followed, the Ottoman patterns of governance and culture established during this golden age would continue shaping the lives of millions and influencing the development of successor states well into the modern era. When Suleiman, the Magnificent, died in 1566, the Ottoman Empire was arguably the most powerful state in history. Its territories spanned 3 continents, its armies had few equals in strength, and its culture was in full bloom. But right at the heart of this imperial triumph, subtle shifts were already underway that would gradually transform the nature of Ottoman power. Over the next 2 centuries, the empire faced growing internal and external pressures, setting in motion what historians have traditionally called the Ottoman period of decline. The seeds of these difficulties had started to sprout before Suleiman's death. His son and successor, Selim II, lacked his father's commanding personality and military experience. Nicknamed Selim the Drunkard because of his fondness for wine, the Sultan preferred pleasure over governing and handed most administrative matters to his capable Grand Vizier, Sekulu Mehmed Pasha. Sekulu maintained the empire's strength, but this pattern of sultans withdrawing from active rule would become increasingly common in the generations that followed. The Ottoman succession system had always been dangerous ground. Earlier sultans had put their brothers to death upon taking the throne. To prevent succession wars after Selim II's relatively peaceful accession, this bloody practice gradually gave way to a new approach, keeping princes in the palace rather than sending them out as provincial governors. While this reduced the violence of fratricide, it created a new problem. Instead of receiving hands-on training in governance and warfare, princes now grew up in the sheltered luxury of the harem. and when they eventually ascended the throne, they often did so as rulers who simply weren't prepared for the job. This shift coincided with the growing influence of what Europeans called the Sultanate of Women, the political power of imperial mothers, wives, and concubines. The valid sultan, or mother of the reigning sultan, wielded enormous influence, especially when her son was young or disengaged from governing. Figures like Qasim Sultan and Turhan Sultan effectively ran the empire during certain periods of the 17th century, building alliances with Janissary leaders and senior officials. While some of these women proved to be capable administrators, the power struggles involved contributed to instability in imperial governance. Meanwhile, the Ottoman military system was undergoing deep changes. The Timur cavalry, once the backbone of Ottoman expansion, became increasingly obsolete as firearms came to dominate the battlefield. The Janissary Corps, originally an elite force of slave soldiers completely loyal to the Sultan, gradually transformed into a hereditary military caste with its own economic interests and political agenda. The Devshirme levy was slowly replaced by the recruitment of free Muslim men, a shift that changed the Corps' character and its patterns of loyalty. Technological stagnation made these military difficulties worse. The Ottomans had once been pioneers in artillery and fortress design, but now they were falling behind European powers that were carrying out their own military revolutions. Ottoman firearms production and tactics couldn't keep up with the pace of Western developments. The once formidable Ottoman navy, which had dominated the Mediterranean during the era of Barbarossa, also lost its technological edge and organizational effectiveness. These military weaknesses surfaced in a series of costly wars. The long Ottoman-Austrian War, from 1593 to 1606, led not to Ottoman victories but to stalemate. A devastating war with Persia ended in territorial losses. The most symbolic setback came in 1571. The Battle of Lepanto was strategically inconclusive, but it showed the world that Ottoman fleets could be beaten by Christian powers. The psychological blow to Ottoman prestige was severe. Economic difficulties emerged alongside the military setbacks. The price revolution of the 16th century, driven partly by American silver flooding into global markets through European trade, caused severe inflation across Ottoman territories. Traditional price controls became increasingly unsustainable. The discovery of sea routes around Africa did divert some Asian trade away from the overland routes the Ottomans controlled. Though this effect turned out to be more gradual than once thought, the Ottoman land regime also underwent troubled transformations. The Timur system, which had granted land rights to cavalry soldiers, gave way to the tax farming system, under which the right to collect taxes was auctioned off to the highest bidder. While this initially brought more revenue to the central treasury, it created the wrong incentives entirely. Tax farmers trying to maximize profits over their limited terms frequently squeezed peasants beyond what was sustainable, damaging agricultural production and driving rural depopulation. In this environment, corruption became routine. The imperial administrative posts that had once symbolized merit-based advancement through the Devshirme system were increasingly bought rather than earned. Accepting gifts in exchange for appointments spread to every level of the bureaucracy. Even the position of Grand Vizier sometimes went not to the most capable candidate, but to whoever made the highest offer. These internal difficulties were developing at the same time as growing external threats. To the west and north, the Ottomans' rivals, the Habsburg and Russian empires, were gaining strength through military modernization and territorial expansion. To the east, Safavid Persia remained a formidable adversary. European commercial penetration of Ottoman markets was also intensifying.
The story doesn't
driven
end
by
here.
merchants
It
operating
deepens.
under
The
the
Ottomans
protection
were
of
no
the
longer just a
capitulations
beylik.
agreements,
They had
which
become
were
a state. They
increasingly
had become
working
a
in
power.
favor
They
of
had
foreign
established
interests at
an
the
order.
expense
But the
of
real
local producers.
transformation had not yet begun, because this was only the foundation, and the true imperial story begins in part 2.